May I ask you some questions? How do you productionize your data or machine learning pipelines in Databricks? Are you sure when you are in production stage, you are running just peer-reviewed and tested codes in Databricks? Or lastly, is it really necessary to deal with overhead of maintaining a production copy of your codes in Databricks Workspace? Let's go! Hello everyone, this is MG and welcome to this video which we are going to talk about a recent feature added to Databricks, which is Git support for your Databricks jobs or workflow. That means as of now, if you want to automate your pipeline, let's say data transformation, ETL, or even ML pipelines through jobs in Databricks, you don't need to maintain and deploy a production copy of your codes to your prod Databricks. Because with this Git support, within your Databricks jobs, you can refer to a code that you have in your Git repository, even in the main branch. So whenever you trigger your jobs, let's say based on a schedule, your job gonna directly execute your codes that you have in your Git repository and your main branch. So you're always running the codes that is reviewed and tested, and also it will remove the overhead of maintaining the code in production in the workspace. And of course, it is pretty safe because no one gonna accidentally edit the codes that you have, because you're always referring your codes from your repository instead of your Databricks workspace when you execute your jobs. Let's check it out. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you will get notified for the next video. Thank you. Alright, welcome everyone to my Azure Databricks workspace. I assume you already know this service. I have created several videos around this service. We talked about how we can use MLOps with Databricks, how we can use Github Actions, MLflow. So all different components of Databricks, we have sort of talked about it. So this is a great service for any machine learning project, data engineering, transformation, any sort of analytics you want to do. You can certainly leverage the service. It is running over Apache Spark, so this is a very suitable choice, specifically when you have big data, whether it's data engineering, machine learning. So you can run your development process over huge compute clusters that you can scale them for any initiative that you're running your codes. So I describe this service in a very high level and summarized manner, again assuming that you are already familiar with the service, because we want to talk about a very specific and a new feature of Azure Databricks that will help you a lot, specifically when you go to production stage. So now what we're going to talk about this time is how can I make a reliable production ready data or machine learning pipeline with Databricks, and specifically Databricks Workflow, or I would say jobs even. But before we talk about workflow or jobs and so on and so forth, let's say how we start the development process in Databricks before we move on to production. So one of the very initial and well-known way to do so is leveraging notebooks. So notebooks are great tool for interactive process. To give you an example, here are my notebooks. For example, this is a notebook we used for previous video I recorded and posted for you, which was about how we can have interpretable machine learning using Spark, and this is the notebook I ran, right? You can see that each notebook has multiple cells, and I can run each cell separately to check out the results and move on to the next cell, check out the results. Then I can go back, do some modifications, run the cell again. So you can see that this is very suitable, like Jupyter Notebook, that I can execute each portion of my cell in a notebook separately, do some modifications, move on. So that's a great experimental and interactive way to develop my codes through the notebook. People can comment here on my notebook. Multiple people at a time can develop code with me within the same notebook. So that's a great teamwork based tool as well that you can leverage it. But now the main question is, can I have this notebook as is and move it all the way to production Well, the answer is no, because as we talked, this is interactive, great tool for development, but for productionization, when we talk about automation, operation, there are some best practices that should be in place if we want to go to production with respecting to DevOps principles, which are for software engineering development process best practices, or when we use DevOps for machine learning, we call it MLOps. So what are the DevOps best practices here and how we can apply them to our code development that we have started using notebooks in Databricks? So for those best practices, the first thing that should be in place is version control. What does version control mean? For any development that you do for any project, you have to have a single source of truth for your code. So when I have my data scientists, data engineers, each of them are developing different component of the project, they have to have a place to push their code to a repository, make sure they can check their code through some unit tests, someone can approve their code and new development before going to the main branch of that repository. And when I say repository, that can be GitHub, that can be Azure DevOps, GitLab, so on and so forth. There are multiple repositories that Databricks support. So the first thing that we need to have in place is repository or version control. The good news is this is not a new feature actually. This is not what we're going to mainly talk about, but that's a must to have for productionization. So you can connect to any repository from here. You just click on repos and then you can add the repo. Here you can say that this is my Git repository, add it there, and you can see different Git providers supported. For example, for my case, it is GitHub. And actually, this is the GitHub repository that I'm gonna use for this video that is coming from, I actually found it from a Databricks article that they mentioned this repository as a reference. So I forked it and to use it as an example to run how we can run our notebook in production. So we are starting with the version control, right? You can just copy the URL of this repository and add it there and you're good to go. But you have to fork this repository first because you need to provide the token of your GitHub repository to Databricks as well. And when you click on submit, I'm not going to do it, I already did. You can see that my GitHub repository that I just showed you is now available here with all the folders and files that I have. So let me just show you again. You can see that here all these codes, folders and structures that I have here is now visible in my Databricks. So this is the main branch, and I'm not going to actually change the code in main branch because that's a code that is already tested. This is the code I assume it is running in production. So you have to clone this in a separate branch, do the changes in your own separate branch, and when you're ready to push it to production, you can say that, hey, I want to push this code from my branch to the main branch. And someone should approve it, some unit test should be running. If you approve all, and then you will see your code is now in main branch and is in operation, right? So how can you clone this in your own branch or create a new branch in Databricks? Well, it's pretty simple. What you can do, just click on here. You see that there's a create branch option. If you give it a name and click on create, what Databricks do, it will create a new branch for you from your repository provider, let's say here GitHub, and then we'll clone all the codes that you have in main branch to your new branch. What does that mean? So if I created a branch named MG, now MG is equivalent to the main branch right now. So I can check the latest codes from production in my own branch and do the changes in my branch and then push it to the main branch. So I'm not going to create because I already created and I named it test. That's why if I click on, okay, let me go back here. Alright, you can see that I have already created one, call it test. And now I am in the test branch, and I want to make sure that I have the latest codes in main branch coming to my test branch so I can do the changes from the latest change that is in main branch. So just click on pull, click on confirm, successfully pull changes. Now I have the latest changes of production in my test branch. So now I am in test right now. This is no longer main, and I can start doing some sort of changes or development and move on with the progress. All right, let's check out what do we have in this repository. So when I pull the code, it is an example of doing some analysis with COVID data. So regardless of the use case, there is no machine learning model training here. I just want to show you the flow of how you can productionize your notebook with the new capability that we're going to talk about. So these are some of the notebooks. Some of them can be used for some interactive process. For example, this is the one that I have finalized, and it's, let's say, the productionized way of the codes. And the other best practice that we need to have in place for productionization is modular code. So that means you have to have your each, let's say here, transformation step in a separate Python code or function that not only you can scale them separately, but also you can run unit test or integration test when you have your code in a modular way. Instead of having everything end-to-end over one single notebook, which is not a best practice, you can modularize it. For example, here, for doing some analysis over this COVID data, I do have transforms.py, and if I click on it, you can see that the way that this code is written is modular. I have different transformation steps in different functions. So then I can separately test this function through some unit tests that I have, which of course unit test is, or integration tests, machine learning model tests, these are needed for productionization stage, right? So you can see that I can do some tests, unit tests over those transformation function that I just showed you. You can see that I am checking the schema, the columns, checking the filter function work very well. That's all. So we talked about two more things: modular code and having some unit tests. And the last thing is we should have CICD. This is needed for DevOps, right? Continuous integration, continuous deployment. Then how can I automate, let's say, this productionized code? This is, let's say, my main notebook that is calling the modular functions that I have. For example, let me show you when I was running this code. There you go. For example, here I am opening those modular code, the transform functions I showed you, which is under COVID analysis folder. So this is sort of the main orchestrator notebook that is calling everything. So when we want to automate this, the first thing that you might think about it in Databricks is job, right? So what is job if you don't know? Job is a way that you can automate the triggering of this notebook. You can have a job that runs based on a schedule, or it can be run manually. Let me show you actually an example. So if you go on workflow, I already created a job using the notebook that I have, right? So if I click on creating a new one, this is the new feature that I'm gonna talk about. Previously, when you wanted to automate a notebook, you have to say that, hey, this is a job I want to create, name a test, and which notebook I want to actually automate it. It's gonna be a notebook in my workspace. That means you have to, before having this new feature, you have to deploy your code or notebook in Databricks Workspace and make sure you always push the latest notebook or productionized notebook in your workspace to make sure that your job is triggered and is automating that notebook, which is the production ready. So it's a kind of overhead. You had to deploy it, making sure you have the latest notebook in your production Databricks Workspace, making sure no one by mistake is touching that productionized notebook, so when your job is running here, it will trigger that notebook which is in your workspace, and if it's changed, it will really affect your production workload, right? So what is the other best practice here, which is the new feature? Instead of triggering my notebook in a workspace as a source, I want to trigger my notebook which is approved by my team, it has passed the unit test, and ready to be triggered. So what would be the best source for that? Yes, you can guess that right. The better source instead of Databricks notebook would be my GitHub. So the codes that I have here in the GitHub, this is the main branch. The code that I have here, for example, this is the main code, the COVID that I just showed you in Databricks. This is the sort of productionized and ready to be used code, and instead of I refer the code in workspace, I want to refer the code that I have in Git. This is the new feature. So instead of clicking on workspace, I can now run a notebook that I have in my GitHub, which is approved by everyone. So I can click on Git provider and then add a Git reference. The same thing. Copy and paste your Git repository here and tell that, well, I want to trigger this notebook which is in main branch. That's the code that has passed the unit test and everything, right? And then click on confirm. If you go to advanced option, you can sort of set up some more advanced settings for this notebook, for this job. If you click on create, you're done. What happened? You'll see that there's a new job created by me. And if I go there, I can see how many times I ran it. So you can see that this job is running over a GitHub notebook, not a Databricks Workspace notebook, which is actually the notebook that I just showed you. And you can see the scheduling, permission stuff, so on and so forth. So if I run it now, let's see what happened. So it is running right now, 5-6 seconds. Let's check out the results. You can see that this is the code that I have in production and it is running. And let me show you actually the GitHub repository. This is actually the code that I'm running. So if I click on it, this is technically what we have. You can see this is what I added as a comment. This is a test, which I have it here. So let me pause the video for a couple of seconds or minutes, making sure these codes are running successfully. And again, these are just a very quick examples that I grabbed the code from Databricks article. I just want to show you the flow. So let me pause recording and we'll come back shortly. Alright, just after a couple of seconds, you can see that everything ran successfully. It's all done. So again, this is a job. I ran it manually, but you can schedule it to let it execute by itself and do the analysis, so on and so forth. So this is the notebook that I have productionized and it is automated using jobs. But now the question is, I want to actually update this code. That's a DevOps process, CICD, continuous integration deployment. How would that be possible in a best practice manner? Remember, we cloned this main branch to a test branch, so this is the place. Let's say I'm gonna change this code. This is the code we have in production. We ran it now. You can change any code, do further development, but let me check something very quick as an example. Let's say I am changing the code, test mg. If I ran it, should be all good. Okay, so now I want to push this code to production. Well, after passing unit test, how would I do it? If I go to the test branch that I have, I want to say that I want to actually, it shows that, oh, you have changed something. That's correct. And I want to commit to push it to the main branch. I can say that this is, sorry, I'm typing slow because I'm using one hand. The other hand, I'm holding the microphone. This is new code, as an example, and can provide some descriptions. So if I click on commit and push, so now my test branch is updated and I can create a pull request to push it to the main branch. Let's open this. There you go. This is a new code already added here. You can put a comment. So I want to push my test branch to the main branch, having my change code to a productionized code. I create a pull request. So let's see what's gonna happen. Oh, you'll see that there's a Github Action running right now. What is Github Action? We use Github Action in Databricks MLOps video. Check that out. I already explained what is Github Action there. That's a great service here. So I'm using Github Action to run some unit tests before merging this test branch to the main branch. I want to make sure the code that MG developed is passing those tests, right? And we had the test codes I showed you in the folder. So let's check out what is GitHub Action doing here. If I go to the details, you'll see that this is checking out the repository and then running some notebooks for me. So what are those notebooks? Those are actually my unit test. And since this time is okay, I think it ran successfully. Yeah, there you go. It seems that I have passed all the unit tests. If I go back, let's make a quick refresh here. There you go, I have passed all the unit tests. But how GitHub knew that, oh, there are some unit tests should be passed before I actually merge it to the main branch? Well, here's a GitHub action. When I fork this repository, there's a GitHub action here. If I click on it, this is actually a YAML file that says run this GitHub action as soon as there's a pull request. This is a triggering mechanism, which we did. We created a pull request and we ran this code. And what it does, it will connect to your Databricks. And you know that for connecting to Databricks, you need two things. You need to know what is your Databricks host. That's actually the URL of your workspace. And the second thing is a Databricks token. So you have to have these two and put them in the secret of your GitHub. If you don't know what is secret, well, just go to the setting, go all the way to the secrets, actions. You can see that I have created these two. You can create a new one, give it a name, and put your secret here. So you know, I assume you know how to create a token in Databricks, and again, the host is just the URL of your Databricks. So add them there, so when you have your GitHub action running, you don't put the secrets here, which is not a best practice. It is more secure. And then what it does, it will run those notebooks, and you can see it is running the unit test that I have in my test folder inside this repository. And that's what it does. That's it. And we can specify some permissions. We can see the results, so on and so forth. So I already explained in detail GitHub action and this YAML file. So in that Databricks MLOps video, I will add that video to the top right of this video screen. So that's how we were able to run this GitHub action based on a pull request and run a unit test. And now when I check that, oh, the new code from MG passed the unit test, so we can merge the pull request, confirm the merge. What does happen? That means MG's code is now in the main branch. Let's check that out. This is the code that MG changed. Look at that. This is the new code. And there you go, test MG that we added is already here. So now this is the beauty of this new feature in Databricks. I have a new productionized notebook, and remember that we have a job that automatically run that code, right? But how would I know that this time this job that we created will run this new notebook that MG changed? So previously you had to deploy this notebook to your workspace and let Databricks know that, hey, in the workspace I just pushed the new code of MG. So when you run this job, run the new MG's code. But this time, no headache, because I'm saying that run this job from the notebook that I have in my GitHub. That means if I run this job now, it will automatically use the new code that is in the main branch because my Databricks job is synced with my GitHub. Let's test it. If I click on run now, this time it should run by itself the new code that we pushed. And you see that I didn't change anything in my job. I didn't deploy any notebook specifically to this workspace. I'm just triggering this job again, which can be triggered based on a schedule. So here I'm doing manually. Let's check that out. I just manually launch it. Let's see what it is running. There you go. This time is running the new notebook that we changed with test MG because it is calling my main branch. So again, I'm not going to wait to run all of it again. This is the same code. We just changed the initial cell here. So what we talked about in this video, we talked about some best practices for productionizing an ML pipeline or data pipeline. Here it was a very simple and high level example. You can have much more detailed jobs, notebooks, modular code, but just wanted to show you the flow, how we can use repository, just fork a branch, create your own branch, make a pull request, and then when you automate this, how your job can be synced with Git, which this is the new feature I wanted to mainly focus on in this video, which will really facilitate the continuous deployment or CD stage of your DevOps, and you don't need to maintain the productionized notebooks in your workspaces because you can just sync them to a GitHub repository directly, making sure that no one can touch your prod notebook because it is safe in main branch of GitHub, and you're always running a notebook that has passed all the unit test stuff that you have in the main branch. And that's all. Hope you enjoyed. Be watchful for someone needing a helping hand. You might be the only one that does. Take care, my friends, and we'll see you in the next video.